Yeah? Okay, I guess some people have been waiting for a few minutes, so I'm going to try and go ahead here then. There's still people coming in, that's okay. So I'm going to talk about the historical case for Alberta independence, why Alberta should become independent. But before I get to the main core of my talk, I want to talk about a Christian perspective on Alberta independence. Like, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and I believe Alberta should become independent, but I'm not arguing that every Bible-believing Christian should believe that. I'm not arguing that this is the Bible teaches Alberta should become independent. So like a Bible-believing Christian could consistently think that Alberta should stay in Canada. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm using the Bible to say Alberta should become independent. There are many issues, political issues that the Bible talks about directly. Like, for example, abortion. The Bible has a position on abortion. Every Christian must oppose abortion. That's the only Christian position. The Bible teaches that clearly. Same with same-sex marriage. There's no such thing as same-sex marriage from a biblical perspective. The Christian position is there's no such thing as same-sex marriage. Every Christian must believe that same point. So there are these kinds of issues where the Bible speaks to directly, and Christians have one position because the Bible speaks to that. Alberta independence is not one of those. There's also political issues that are determined by matters of prudence. There's a lot of political issues that the Bible doesn't speak to directly. I'll just use some examples. Like when Alberta became a province, one of the major decisions that had to be made which would be the capital city, Edmonton or Calgary. I don't think anybody would argue that there's a biblical perspective on which of those cities should be a capital city, right? And so, there's also, we know that in Romans 13, God establishes civil government. There has to be a civil government. But there are different ways of arranging a civil government that would be consistent with the biblical perspective. And the Bible doesn't give really specific details about which geographical area should be under particular government or what the details of how that government should be structured are. And, even something like, because in the Bible, a nation should defend its citizens, so it should have an army. So having an army is a biblical position for a country, but the size of that army and how it's organized, those kinds of decisions are not stipulated by the Bible. So the point I'm making is there are certain issues where the Bible is very clear that this is the Christian position, and then there's other issues that we have to determine by prudence depending on our circumstances and our situations. And so Alberta's relationship to Canada is one of those latter issues that we determine as a matter of our situation, what's best for our situation. But from a Christian perspective, one of the key aspects of support for independence is that Alberta independence can be achieved legally and peacefully. In 1998, the Supreme Court created a constitutional pathway for provinces to become independent in Canada. Then in 2000, Parliament passed the Clarity Act to fill out some of those details of how a province would become independent. I'm going to talk in more detail about these matters, but the point that I'm making here is that in supporting Alberta independence, Christians are fulfilling their obligation to being law-abiding citizens and honoring the governing authorities. This is not revolution. Advocating Alberta independence, it's not revolution, it's not rebellion, it's following the law. Alberta independence can be achieved by a peaceful, democratic process of voting. It is completely nonviolent. Now, if the independence movement had advocated violence, I don't think Christians should support it. But it's a nonviolent, perfectly democratic process that is offered to us under Canadian constitutional law, and therefore Christians can support that. Now, in saying that I don't think the Bible teaches that Alberta specifically should become independent, there's also no counter-argument from the Bible that Alberta should stay within Canada. It's just one of those issues that's a prudence issue and not a specifically Christian issue. Now in Jeremiah 29:7, the Lord says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." Now, of course, I'm not suggesting we're in exile, but I think there's a general principle here that as Christians, we want what's best for our community. How can we do what's best for our community in loving our neighbors and helping other people to enjoy the benefits and prosperity that are open to us? In my view, Alberta becoming independent is what's best for Alberta's prosperity, what's best for Alberta's welfare. So there's a general principle here that I'm doing what's best for the welfare of my city and supporting Alberta independence. So I just wanted to clarify that at the beginning. Now, to properly understand the case for Alberta independence, it's easiest to understand this sentiment as building over time. For generations, Westerners have felt that they've been ignored and even exploited within Canada, and eventually this feeling has reached the point where many of us believe that the only solution is for Alberta to become independent of Canada. The U.S. Declaration of Independence uses the phrase, "a long train of abuses," to justify why the 13 colonies needed to become independent from the United States. And I think also that Alberta has suffered a long train of abuses from Canada's federal government that justifies why we need to become independent. The sense that Canadian Confederation has been unfair to the West has been building for many years, even decades. What is now known as the Prairie West in Canada was originally part of Rupert's Land, the northwestern territory of the Hudson's Bay Company. And in 1870, Canada purchased Rupert's Land and annexed it to Canada. And what's important to understand is there were already people living here. There were thousands of people living here, in particular the Red River settlement and what is now kind of the Winnipeg area. There was thousands of people living there who had different ideas of what their best political future should be, and they were not consulted. They were not consulted. They were just annexed to Canada and told that they were to become part of Canada. They were not very happy about that, many of them, and that unhappiness was one of the contributing factors for the first real rebellion in 1869 to 1870. So there was evidence of Western discontent with Canada right from the very beginning of our relationship with Canada. Then, of course, the prairies were filled with settlers to pioneer the land and create an agricultural economy, and of course that was good. But there was a protective tariff to ensure that Western farmers had to buy their manufactured goods and equipment from central Canada. That meant that the Westerners had to pay higher prices for their farming equipment than otherwise. Also, when they sold their grain, they had to sell through middlemen who took part of the price, and the Western farmers had to pay the transportation costs. So the Western farmers had to pay more for their equipment, and they received less for their product. Now, there's a famous cartoon from 1915. I'll just hold it up. I'm not sure how well some of you will see this, but I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is a very famous cartoon of a cow standing across Canada, and the three prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, are feeding the cow, and the cities of Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal are getting the milk. So this is a representation of the feeling of exploitation. This cartoon was done in 1915. That's 110 years ago. So we're talking about Western discontent going back a very long time. Now, these kinds of grievances kept Westerners unhappy about their place within Canada, and they led to political action to address those concerns. But they were not angry enough to consider Western independence. Western independence was not on the board in those days. Instead, what they did was they formed alternative political parties. Especially in Alberta, we formed alternative political parties and turned away from the Eastern Canadian parties to govern us here. So from 1921 to 1935, our provincial government was operated by the United Farmers of Alberta. That was the political party. And in the 1920s, the main federal party in Alberta was the Progressive Party of Canada. So we turned away from the Eastern parties and had created our own parties. Now, even more profound than those parties that I mentioned was the election of the social credit government in Alberta in 1935. Like, that was something of international news. Like, we were the first jurisdiction to embrace the social credit idea, and we elected a social credit government. So it was international news, and even the Boston Globe newspaper called Alberta crazy for doing so. But you might remember Alberta Report magazine. It was founded by Ted Byfield, and this is what Ted Byfield wrote about Alberta's election of the social credit government in 1935. He wrote this: "While other provinces whined about the depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." So Alberta did fight back against central Canada, but not by trying to become independent. But that all changed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1968. When he became Prime Minister, a threshold was crossed, and many Westerners, for the very first time, began to consider the possibility of Western independence. The first serious organization of separatist organizations started in 1970, 2 years after Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. One of the things he did that angered Westerners was he brought in the Official Languages Act, which made French much more prominent across Canada, and in particular on the prairies. There were a lot of people here who felt they were having French thrust down their throats. But Pierre Trudeau, part of the reason he got involved in politics was he wanted to keep Quebec in Canada, and he wanted to make Quebecers feel more welcome across Canada, so he wanted to increase the presence of French as a way of doing so. So the very first book then that was written about Western independence was written in 1971, 3 years after Trudeau became Prime Minister. It was called The Unfinished Revolt: Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays edited by John Barr and Owen Anderson, and the reason that's significant is John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education, and Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta's Premier Harry Strom, who was our last social credit premier. So these were influential men writing about these issues. Now, most of the essays did not specifically address the idea of Alberta becoming independent, but John Barr's did. He actually came to these two conclusions, and I'll quote: "Number one, we must strive for a more justly constituted Canada. Number two, if Canada loses her political viability, the West must strike out against the odds to try and build an independent state in this corner of North America." So his proposal was, first, let's try and fix Canada. We'll try and fix Canada first. If we can't fix Canada, then we're going to have to become independent. So that was 1971, and in 1971, that was an excellent argument. We did need to try to fix Canada at that time, but we've spent more than 50 years trying to fix Canada since that time, and so I don't think it's a legitimate argument anymore. Anyway, the most significant impetus for Alberta separatism emerged 2 years after that book was printed. In 1973, there was an energy crisis in the Middle East, and that caused the price of oil to skyrocket. There was a war in the Middle East, and a bunch of the Arab countries that had oil decided to boycott selling of oil to Western countries that supported Israel. So because of that, the price of oil basically went from about $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in just a matter of weeks. So Alberta was about to really cash in on its oil resources. You know, when we discovered oil in 1947, that was very significant for our province because we were very poor at that time, but still the price of oil was relatively low, and although we did benefit, we weren't reaping huge profits the way we would afterwards when the price of oil went up. So the price of oil went up to about $12 a barrel, and Alberta was going to really cash in. But Pierre Trudeau did a couple of things to prevent us from cashing in the way we should have. For one thing, he mandated that the price of Western Canadian oil would be kept low to benefit the eastern provinces. So even though the world price was high, the Canadian price of oil sold sold within Canada was kept low, so we didn't get the profit that we should have. And also when Alberta exported oil to the United States, Trudeau put on an export tax on oil for Alberta's oil to the United States. So we'd get the world price for oil, and the federal government would take a huge percentage of that, which should have gone to Alberta. Because under the Constitution, natural resources are provincial resources, and Alberta should have been reaping that money, and Pierre Trudeau put that export tax to take that money, and our premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, called that export tax, quote, the biggest rip-off of any province that's ever occurred in Confederation's history. Like, that's how unique it was. This, of course, made many Albertans angry, and the very first really significant separatist organization was formed in 1974 called the Independent Alberta Association. Now, throughout the 1970s, the Alberta government under Peter Lougheed fought with Trudeau, very aggressively to try to get Alberta a fair share for our oil. Then in 1979, there was a federal election, and Joe Clark was elected Prime Minister under a minority progressive conservative government. Like, Joe Clark was from Alberta, so it was expected that Alberta would finally get a good deal with the federal government. Unfortunately, because he had a minority government, his government fell after just a few months, and there was a new election for February of 1980. Of course, in that February 1980 election, Pierre Trudeau was re-elected. Now, there's something very significant about this 1980 federal election. The campaign theme, as stated by one of the prominent Liberal campaign officials, Keith Davey, was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." So what was happening was the Liberal Party was running against Alberta, like saying Alberta was the bad guy, and if you re-elect us as the federal government, we'll put Alberta in its place. Now, the idea of running an election campaign by attacking one particular region was new and extremely divisive. This reflected a significant change. Now we had a federal political leader deliberately exploiting regional divisions for political benefit. Like in any large country like Canada, you're going to have different regions with different interests that are in competition, and one of the jobs of a federal leader is to promote national unity by smoothing over those differences. And instead, for the first time in Canada, we had a political leader deliberately exploiting regional differences to get back into power, and it worked. Now, Westerners were very angry that Trudeau was returned to Prime Minister, and separatist organizations began to form and to grow. Then in 1980, Trudeau's government brought in the National Energy Program, or NEP, which was designed to increase the federal government's control over Alberta's energy resources. And this led to a huge surge in independent support. Now, it's important to remember that the National Energy Program devastated Alberta's economy. People lost their jobs, their businesses, and their homes. And I've actually met people this year and traveling and talking about these issues. I've met 3 separate people who could recount to me people they knew personally or people they knew of who committed suicide at the time of the National Energy Program because of the economic devastation it brought into their lives. And this, the National Energy Program was deliberately designed to attack Alberta. So these job losses and business losses and suicides are the result of deliberate government policy. Now, Trudeau's anti-Alberta policies, and especially the National Energy Program, permanently changed Alberta's political culture when it comes to the support for independence. Before 1980, whenever they did polling for support about Alberta independence, the support levels were just single digits, like 5 or 6 or 7%. From 1980 onwards, whenever they've polled for support for Alberta independence, it's always been double digit. In the early years, like 15 or 16%, but by the 90s, it was consistently like 20 or 25% or more, and it's even higher now. So Trudeau permanently changed our political culture by what he did to Alberta. And this is why I say Pierre Trudeau is the father of the Alberta independence movement. He literally created it with his policies. And it's important to remember that no province in Canadian history has been attacked the way Alberta was attacked by Pierre Trudeau's government. No province in history. It's completely unique that way. Anyway, there was large support for independence at that time, and in 1982 there was a provincial by-election where the candidate of a separatist party, the Western Canada Concept Party, that candidate was elected in the Olds Disbury constituency, the first and only time a separatist candidate has been elected in Western Canada. Now, although there was this surging support for independence in Alberta, there were still many Albertans who thought we could best reform Canada instead of getting out. Like, if we reformed Canada, make it more suitable for Alberta. So it's kind of like what John Barr was saying, let's try and fix Canada. Now, one of these people, a very significant person, was Senator Ernest Manning. He had been Alberta's longest-serving premier. He became a senator. So he and two other very prominent Western Canadians wrote a book called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. What they were proposing was that Canada's federal national institutions could be reformed to improve Western representation within those national institutions so that the Western voice could be heard within the national government. Their argument was that if we could reform the national institutions so that Western voices could be heard within the national government, there would be no desire for the West to separate from Canada. Perfectly reasonable argument. They thought that Senate reform would be the way to do that because, as you know, like, we have an appointed Senate which is not representative, that does not represent the regions, and so we could change that. If we could properly represent the regions, that would give us the voice in the national government we would need, and we would no longer feel we need to become independent. And they made this proposal in 1981, right when Canada's constitution was being rewritten. So that was the time to make this proposal. They could have put that in there, but that was ignored. Now, Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister in 1984, and he was replaced by John Turner as Liberal leader and Prime Minister. A few months later, there was a federal election, and the Progressive Conservatives under Brian Mulroney were elected in a landslide victory. Now, this looked really good for Alberta. Every member of Parliament we had was part of Mulroney's government. Most of the Western members of Parliament were part of Mulroney's government. Finally, the Liberals were gone. Trudeau is gone. Things are going to go well for us now. We've got our guy there. He's going to take care of us. It's all going to be good. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. Just a couple years later, after getting elected, there was an important issue that had to be decided. Like, Canada had recently purchased the CF-18 fighter jets, and the contract to maintain those fighter jets was very expensive, a very big government contract. There's only two cities in Canada with facilities to maintain those fighter jets, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition to see which city would be best to be able to maintain those fighters. Winnipeg won the contract under the government's criteria, and the government awarded the contract to Montreal because they needed to boost their support in Quebec. Now, many Westerners felt very ripped off by this. Obviously, this was a betrayal. We put those guys there, and they stabbed us in the back. So it wasn't like Trudeau attacking us. It was the guys we put there betraying us. Now, the point here, I want to say is, a Conservative government is better for Alberta than a Liberal government. There's no question about it. The Conservative government is better than a Liberal government. But the Conservatives still face the situation that any party faces in trying to be the government in Canada. They have to cater to central Canada. So even the federal Conservative Party, even though they're better for Alberta, they still will put their first priority in satisfying central Canada over Alberta and over the West. And this is true even for Pierre Poilievre. So we know that Pierre Poilievre essentially supports the equalization program the way it is right now. He supports keeping Canada in the Paris Climate Change Accord, which compels the Canadian government to enact policies that are harmful for Alberta's energy industry. And he also wants Alberta to remain in the Canada Pension Plan rather than having its own pension plan. Now, I'm not trying to personally attack Poilievre. He might not personally believe these things, but it's the Canadian system forces him to take these kinds of positions. If he wants to be Prime Minister, he has to support policies that are popular in central Canada and not necessarily in Alberta. That's the only way he can become Prime Minister, and so the system forces him to do that. So the Conservative Party is not the solution to Alberta's problem. It's better, like I said. They're kind of like, they offer us a reprieve from the Liberal Party, but the Conservative Party is just a Band-Aid solution. Anyway, with the uproar over the CF-18 issue, a new Western movement was created that led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada to satisfy the Western political interests. It was led by Preston Manning, the son of Ernest Manning, the premier I mentioned earlier. Now, I have a photocopy of a pamphlet here from 1987, a new federal political party to represent the West. This pamphlet was written and created and published to promote the creation of the Reform Party of Canada. And it's written in 1987, and I just want to read a few sentences from this from 1987. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. Now, the reason I wanted to read that, that's 38 years ago that was written, and you could write the exact same words today. The exact same words today mean this, are still valid, and that's 38 years ago. Nothing has changed in 38 years. Now, that was 1987. The following year, there was a very good progressive conservative MP from Edmonton named David Kilgour. He wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians and Confederation. And he wanted to write this book to explain to Canadians why Westerners were so dissatisfied. And he covered the history of Western Canada and how we'd been exploited by Eastern Canada. And he concluded his book by saying this: "The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all other regions of the country." So in 1988, 37 years ago, the time had come to address the long-standing injustice. Now, it did look at that time like maybe that long-standing injustice was going to be addressed, because that's when the Reform Party was starting to build, so Westerners were beginning to take this seriously. Now, a major goal of the Reform Party was the creation of what was called a Triple E Senate. They wanted to reform the Senate. That'd be a Senate where the senators are elected, where they have effective powers, and they have equal representation from each province. If we had a Senate like that, the Western voice could be heard in the national government. Elected senators with effective powers and equal representation. Now, at that time, when they were proposing that, our Premier Don Getty was 100% in support of a Triple E Senate, and he was so much in support that he held Canada's very first Senate election in October of 1989, which was won by General Stan Waters of the Reform Party. So in 1989, we had our very, very first elected senator ever in Canadian history. Now, Alberta has held a few other elections like that since then, and some of them have been appointed, but for the most part, senators are just chosen by the Prime Minister. Now, the Reform Party won 52 seats in the 1993 federal election. It won 60 seats in the 1997 election. Like, it kind of looked like it was gaining some momentum, but the Reform Party over time began to focus more and more on becoming a national party and trying to achieve national power rather than focusing on representing the Western interests. So in the year 2000, it converted itself into the Canadian Alliance. And then in the year 2003, it merged with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to become the new Conservative Party of Canada under leader Stephen Harper. Of course, Stephen Harper was one of the original Reform Party members of Parliament, and he was an MP from Calgary. So when he was elected Prime Minister in 2006, the West felt relieved. In fact, his victory speech, he said, "The West is in." Like, the Reform Party slogan had been, "The West wants in," and when he was elected, he said, "The West is in." It actually didn't turn out that way, but Westerners did trust Stephen Harper. He was one of us. He was from Calgary. He'd been a Reform Party member. We trusted Stephen Harper as Prime Minister to take care of our interests. So as long as Stephen Harper was in power, there was basically no Alberta independence movement to speak of. Unfortunately, in 2015, there was another federal election that was won by Justin Trudeau of the Liberal Party, and Justin Trudeau's agenda was to fight climate change, and he felt the best way to fight climate change was by shutting down Alberta's energy industry. He wanted to choke Alberta's oil industry so it could be phased out. So Alberta is currently facing a future of economic decline due to Justin Trudeau's climate change policies. Now, you'll say, well, Justin Trudeau's not Prime Minister anymore, and that's true. We have Mark Carney now, but Mark Carney hasn't done anything to remove Justin Trudeau's anti-energy policies except for cancelling the carbon tax, I guess. So among Justin Trudeau's policies was Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which many people call the No More Pipelines Bill, because we essentially can't get any pipelines built under the regulations that Trudeau put in with that law. On top of that was Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which prevents Alberta oil from being exported off the coast of BC, and many people call that bill the Alberta Tanker Ban. Now, there's various climate policies that Trudeau has brought in to kind of essentially subvert our constitutional right to develop our resources. Like, under the Constitution, as I mentioned, natural resources are in provincial jurisdiction. We should be able to develop them, but Trudeau brought in these various climate change policies that do indirectly what the Constitution does not allow the federal government to do directly, and they were able to kind of constrain Alberta's ability to develop our natural resources. Now, the Alberta government challenged Justin Trudeau's carbon tax at the Supreme Court in 2021, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Trudeau's carbon tax. There was a couple of judges who dissented, and one of them was Russell Brown. And Russell Brown pointed out the implications of this carbon tax decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. Let me just read part of what he said. He said this: "Okay, this decision in favor of Trudeau's carbon tax, the implications of it go far beyond the carbon tax law, opening the door to federal intrusion by way of the imposition of national standards into all areas of provincial jurisdiction, including interprovincial trade and commerce, health, and the management of natural resources." That is, he was saying that the line of argumentation of the Supreme Court's decision leads to increased federal control over many areas of provincial jurisdiction. So that was a very threatening Supreme Court decision. Now, it's important to realize, too, that even as Trudeau and Mark Carney have been trying to shut down Alberta's oil industry, they've been reaping billions of dollars annually from Alberta's oil industry. There's a University of Calgary economist named Robert Manzel who's been studying the transfer of Alberta's money to the federal government over decades. And in 2020, he produced a study that showed from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net contribution of $630 billion to Eastern Canada, or the federal government. $630 billion, that's a net up to 2018, and we've been giving them money every year since, and so it would be much more than $630 billion now, perhaps close to $700 billion. So they want to shut down this sector of our economy that generates so much money for them. So far, I've been talking about all the bad news. Now I do have some good news. And that good news is provincial secession is allowed under Canada's constitutional law. Now, you're probably aware there's been a Quebec separatist movement for many years that led in 1980 to a separatist referendum, and in 1995 also for a referendum on independence. The first one was defeated significantly. The 1995 referendum was defeated only by a very small margin. So after that 1995 referendum was defeated very marginally, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada to ask the Supreme Court's legal opinion on whether Quebec could unilaterally declare independence from Canada. Let me just explain that a bit better. So our federal government this wasn't a specific court case, they can ask the Supreme Court for what Canada's constitutional law is on certain areas. So they send this reference case, like the provinces can do this too with their appeals court, but the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada saying, can Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada according to Canada's constitutional law? And the Supreme Court ruled no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada according to Canada's constitutional law. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority of people voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate with Quebec over its independence. So with this decision, the Supreme Court of Canada created a constitutional law for any province in Canada to become independent from Canada if it follows the proper constitutional legal process. So Alberta, people who support Alberta independence, we can confidently move towards Alberta independence, knowing full well that we are acting within Canada's constitutional law. We are acting legally and constitutionally. Now, this contrasts actually sharply with many other countries, perhaps all other countries, because most countries, their constitution does not allow a particular jurisdiction to become independent. You might remember in 2017, the Spanish region of Catalonia voted overwhelmingly to become independent of Spain. But Spain would not acknowledge that referendum. I think they jailed the leaders, and that area did not become independent. That's because Spain's constitution does not allow a jurisdiction to become independent. So some people say, well, you can't become independent. Well, Canada's constitutional law is different from many other countries, perhaps any other country, because we have specific constitutional law that allows a province to become independent if it follows the proper process. Now, to fulfill out the details of the secession reference case of 1998, in the year 2000, as I mentioned, Parliament passed the Clarity Act. Like the Supreme Court's decision gives kind of constitutional law frameworks for how the province becomes independent, and so the Clarity Act kind of gives the details of what needs to be done for a province to become independent. So we have the constitutional law and the official legislation for doing that. Now, everything I've said so far leads to one conclusion. Alberta must become independent. Over the last several decades, there have been many proposals by serious people about how to improve Alberta's situation within Canada. I've mentioned John Barr in 1971, Ernest Manning and his colleagues in 1981, and MP David Kilgour in 1988. These were influential citizens, but none of their recommendations were implemented. Most significant, of course, was Preston Manning and the Reform Party of Canada. Alberta voted overwhelmingly for the Reform Party and sent mostly Reform Party MPs to Ottawa during the 1990s. They were good people, and they tried to do their best for Alberta and for the West. But they found that the system cannot be fixed, and that is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that is beneficial for Alberta. We can learn from history, and we must learn from history. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it cannot be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but Canada does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is for us to get out. If we keep asking Central Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they'll just keep laughing at us. They know there's nothing we can do, so they laugh at us. But if we hold a referendum and vote for independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. complaining to Ottawa about unfair treatment, launching court challenges against unfair policies like the carbon tax, and even a referendum on equalization, these have accomplished nothing. They've been tried and found wanting. Therefore, achieving independence must become the goal if Alberta is going to have any sort of meaningful future. Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about and become an independent country. Thank you. So I got to check the time here. I think we started a bit late, but I guess there's 5 minutes for questions if someone wanted to. Yep.
Can you talk more about what the political process is actually for independence? Because it seems to me that you have to have substantial agreement from the rest of Canada, basically say goodbye. So can you speak more to what some of the details of that?
Sure, like in terms of, like, let's say there's a successful independence referendum. Yep, yep.
So we get over that hump.
Yeah, so let's say there's a successful independence referendum. Now, the federal government and the provinces, they're obligated to negotiate with that province over its independence. Now, that doesn't guarantee that the province would become independent, but they have to negotiate that. So what I think would happen is if we get that clear majority, on a clear question for Alberta independence, I think the federal government will most likely come back with a counter offer. They're not going to just say, okay, take off, right? They're going to say, well, okay, wait a minute. Now we finally realize that you guys aren't happy. Oh, we didn't know that before, And so maybe we can make some compromises here. That's what I think would happen. And so then it would be up to Albertans whether they want to, it could be, like theoretically, the federal government could make a good offer, right? That could be enough of an offer to convince Albertans to stay. Could. Or maybe it's just, not a serious offer, and Albertans will still want to go to independent. What the Supreme Court talked about, though, in that decision, like the Supreme Court brought up the possibility, like what if a province votes for independence and the federal government just puts obstacles in the way and is not negotiating seriously? And the Supreme Court pointed out, if the world is watching, right, there's other democratic countries. If Alberta was to follow the democratic process and they can see that the federal government is not following the democratic process, the other democratic countries are going to see what's going on. And if we can get international recognition at some point, that would bring us towards our independence. And actually right now, like we have a kind of a window of opportunity right now. The Trump administration has indicated to the Alberta Prosperity Project they have some sympathy with our cause. If we voted in favor of independence, they would be very likely to recognize us as independent, and that would smooth the process whereby we become independent. Because if the American administration was to recognize Alberta independence, there's very little that the federal government could do to prevent it. So that would be kind of weighing in our favor. So if we were able to get the referendum, say, next year with Trump still in power, the federal government is under a much stronger obligation to negotiate fairly with us and not just, throw obstacles, you know what I mean? So the international situation is an important aspect to this, as the Supreme Court said, that if the federal government is blocking us, we could be able to get support from other democratic countries. The key support would be the United States. And if we got American support, which apparently is the case, like let's say Alberta Prosperity Project says, because we have that American support, if we get that majority referendum next year, it'd be very hard for for Ottawa to block the process, I think. Now, let's say it's 4 years down the road and there's a Democratic administration in the United States, we'd have a different calculation then, right? But right now we do have this window of opportunity because we're very likely to get the international recognition, and that would prevent the federal government from being able to block us from becoming independent. But if we don't have that international support, it's going to be very difficult. But like I said, the Supreme Court said, other countries are going to be watching. And if one side is playing by the rules and the other side's not playing by the rules, other countries are going to pay attention and take that seriously too. Oh, wow, I got some questions. I wish I had moderators. Sorry.
Just a quick question about, what would be some of the main obstacles we would face if we became independent, like maybe creating our own pension plan? What about our military, all these kinds of things? What would be some of the biggest challenges, I guess, that we would face when we become independent?
For sure there'd be challenges, that's right. There's actually a proposal by, there was a professor at the University of Alberta called Leon Craig, and he wrote this article proposing what he calls the Ministry of Independence. If, let's say, Alberta is moving towards independence, we'd create a ministry specifically with a minister and his bureaucracy that would specifically look at those questions, and we'd have lawyers and other experts who would deal specifically with those questions because they'd have expertise in those fields. And so there would be those obstacles, but we could have people with expertise working on those, because I wouldn't be able to just offer solutions off the top, right, kind of thing. So we'd have a Ministry of Independence preparation, and then when we become independent, we'd have a Ministry of Independence to carry us over the hurdle to deal with those things. So like I say, there would be, for sure there'd be obstacles. I mean, nothing's easy, right? But they could be overcome by having like a specific government department dedicated to overcoming those. Okay. Oh, sorry, I had someone here first. Actually, I don't know if I can help someone line up or something. It's hard for me to know who's first, but go ahead.
So
No.
I just wondered, when you look around this room, and I know if we just listen to Ken Ham, we're just different melanin, right? If you look, I'm Latin American, and most Latin Americans that we know have no idea about any of this. They're low information voters. And so how do you start to reach out to them? I mean, because there's a large group of people that if they understood this and that's what's happening in Alberta, you could actually bring them on board. Because most Latin Americans are very freedom orientated as well. I would say that in the Filipino community as well. But so how do you start informing them? How do we reach out to them? How do we educate them? Like
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful in this particular, it's needed. We need more people.
Yeah.
I don't think we're ready for a referendum yet. I think we would do a disservice to ourselves if we did have a referendum right now.
Oh, yeah, she's asking how do you spread this information to more people? Because there's more people who would be sympathetic if they knew what our cause was and what our our history and so on like that. So she's asking how do we reach out to those people to get them? Well, like there's a lot of materials online now. Like I recommend the Alberta Prosperity Project. Their website has lots of questions and answers about these kind of things. And so there's even on Facebook there's various groups. I guess on Facebook you have to kind of watch out because there's also groups that aren't very credible on there. But there are some the credible ones on there if you can identify them that have good materials. And just to put in a plug, I write books on this if you're interested. I got a book table for more information. But yeah, I guess for people who are online, there's a lot of online materials. And I'd like to say the Alberta Prosperity Project has spent a lot of time and effort in creating information on their website. So that'd be just an easy way if you can get people to look at that and take that would have kind of the information, probably the best single place to go for people. Okay.
What constitutes the majority? Is it just the votes?
Excellent question. So the Supreme Court determined it has to be a clear majority vote. So what is a clear majority? Nobody knows what a clear majority would be, and there'd be difference of opinion. That's a very difficult question. I know there are people who argue 50% plus one is a clear majority. I don't agree with that, and from a political science perspective, when you're dealing with regular political issues like tax rates and where roads should go and stuff, 50% plus one is fine. But when you're creating a new country, you need significant buy-in from the population. And so I'm not going to tell you what the clear majority is because I don't know, but it's got to be more than 50% plus one because you can't have someone change their mind the next day and it's dead. You got to have a really significant buy-in, so it's got to be above 51% from my perspective. And I have friends who are angry with me when I talk like this, but it's got to be well over 50% to be a clear majority. Yeah.
Your game plan for Alberta independence is based on a set of rules that comes out of that Supreme Court. It's a reference case. It's not a law case. And why couldn't another government come to the Supreme Court before an implementation of a separatist plan is put in place with a different reference case? Or that system the Supreme Court has laid out to be trumped by the legislature, the federal government, to make a law where the court has indicated it's an open question. So the lawmaking process could shut down the basis that you're moving forward with this independence plan.
There are ways the government can put obstacles in its path, but from my perspective, it's a reference case, but it establishes Canadian constitutional law. Another thing to keep in mind, this was done kind of as a gift to Quebec. Quebec was the specific case at point. Yeah, go ahead.
But despite the fact, a reference case is a reference case. It's not a binding legal decision with a precedent that can be applied. It's a point for guidance and clarification. It's like Jack Black, these rules for pirates, they're guidelines, the code. So this reference case is the legal foundation you're proceeding with. I think it's flimsy and it's a weak point. If I was a lawyer in Ottawa, I would be drafting in Parliament and getting ready to shut down the possibility of this process that you're outlining to use. legitimize an independence movement. So are you prepared to deal with Ottawa lawyers?
Well, like it's not me personally. Like I'm speaking on behalf of this. There would be people who are prepared, but I think the key thing is that is our constitutional law as it stands at this moment, right? So we have to work. We have a legal process in place based on that reference case and the Clarity Act. That's what we have to work forward to. Like we don't have a different process. That is the process that's been offered to us to every province, and so that's what we have to work with. We don't have something else to work with, right? So, okay, yeah.
Practically, what can we do who want to celebrate as Albertans? Like I've had someone come to my door asking me to sign the petition to Alberta to stay in Canada, and I feel like those voices are louder right now. How do we make our voices louder, practically?
Like, well, one of the things Alberta Prosperity Project is doing is they're collecting contact information of people who are willing to sign the petition for an independence referendum. So if you go to the Alberta Prosperity Project website, you can sign up there. That's kind of a really easy thing to do. Also, if you look at their website, they're having meetings in different parts of Alberta constantly, and you might want to go to a meeting and talk to some of their people. Like they have different levels of involvement, I guess. Like you can volunteer for them and do more things. So partly depends on how much time you have and what your level of commitment could be. But if you were to contact them, they'd probably have different suggestions depending on how much time you have as to what you'd be able to help out doing, or promoting it online, things like that. So, yeah. Actually, there's guys ahead of you. Sorry, Ted. Okay, someone's back there. Yes.
Can you speak to where the question is now? I know Alberta Prosperity proposed a question, and then there's another question, and which question does have precedent right now as far as the referendum goes?
Yeah, so the Alberta Prosperity Project has proposed a question under the constitutional process for Alberta to become independent. And so the way the law is in Alberta, they submitted that to Elections Alberta, and Elections Alberta has submitted it to court to make sure it's a constitutional question. And so I think in November the court gets to decide on that. And I think it's a constitutional question. I heard that the lawyers who wrote that question had the Clarity Act in front of them, so they would make sure they are very concerned to make sure they had the right question. Now the other referendum question is Tom Lukaszik's, but Tom Lukaszik didn't sign his up as a constitutional question. It's just kind of a general policy question. Like there's different categories of referendums, so his could not actually bring us to independence because it wasn't filed under the right category, the right criteria or whatever. But it would be symbolically if people like his question is to keep Alberta in Canada, but people who wanted Alberta out could vote no to that, and it would very much strengthen our movement if we got a very good. Large number of votes on that, but right now right now Elections Alberta is checking his signatures to make sure they're legitimate signatures, assuming he's got enough, which probably is the case. That gets submitted to the provincial government, and then the provincial government has to decide what they want to do with it, and they have some different options because it's not a constitutional one. Like if it was APP's question, they would have to go to referendum, but because Lukaszik did it under a different category, the provincial government can hold that as a referendum question if they want, or they have some other options, so it might not become a referendum question. So that's the best of my knowledge on those things.
So both questions could go forward and be asked over.
Pardon me?
Both questions could still be asked over. That doesn't circumvent the
Yeah, I don't think Tom Lukaszik can circumvent the AP one. I don't think so. Like I heard an APP lawyer, I think when I was at the legislature at that big rally, and I'm quite sure Keith Wilson said he's expecting an independence referendum in 2026, just from what they know at this point, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
If Alberta separates, will you take refugees from BC?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We'll think we're refugees. Yes.
One of the questions, I'm from British Columbia, so that not necessarily affect me, but one of the questions I have is, what about the provincial law? I think your province has a law to do with Indigenous land claims. That may prevent you from going independent, if I'm correct. Are you familiar with any of that?
Sorry, can you say that again, please? Like that.
Provincial law.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just going that there was a law that was written a long time ago or a number of years ago that dealt with the Indigenous land claims that would prevent you from going independent.
I don't think there's a law, but there are some First Nations chiefs who say they can prevent us from becoming independent. Alberta has treaties, so our land is by treaty. We're not in the same situation as BC, because my understanding is BC has a lot of open land claims, whereas Alberta doesn't. But there are still First Nations who claim that they can prevent us from becoming independent. But one of the things you have to remember, there's no unanimous voice on First Nations matters in Alberta. The First Nations people are like the rest of us. Some of them are Federalists and some of them are for independence, and there's different things in between. So different reserves and different tribes would have different views on this. So there's not one First Nations perspective on Alberta independence. Like I could only speculate on these things, but my view would be that let's say we voted for independence, and let's say some of the tribes voted for independence and some voted to stay in Canada. Like for me, I'd be willing to give Canada those little pockets of the people who wanted to stay with Canada so that they could stay under federal jurisdiction. We could just negotiate how that would work with Alberta. And then those people could stay in Canada, under the federal jurisdiction and get whatever the benefit of Canada is, as opposed to being under Alberta. So I think we can be flexible, but I don't think they're going to be able to block it based on the law that I'm aware of. So, okay. Actually, is this overtime yet? Oh, we still got, I don't know. If you guys feel free to leave, I won't feel offended this time. But if you want to talk, I'm here.
Separate from you.
Yeah, that's right. You can separate from me. So, anyway, sorry, I'm sure I missed questions, but it's hard to see hands. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just looking at your stand on guard for the ebook, as far as Canada's history being Christian, can we start? Is there a benefit, or is there going to be problems with a Christian heritage in a new Alberta? We don't have that history from 150 years ago of Protestant Catholics. What do we have in Alberta to match that?
Yeah.
And do we have anything that can have a foundation?
Okay, excellent question. And let me just put it this way. If Alberta becomes independent, we need to have a strong Christian influence as a foundation of our government. Because if we become independent and just stick with what we have in terms of the secular direction, we have not achieved anything. And so, I am an advocate for Alberta independence, and I hope we vote for independence. But there's no guarantee that we're going to end up with a better country. It's only we can only end up with a better country if God is going to bring revival to us, right, and turn our people to Thee. And that's the same for all of Canada. You know what I mean? So I do think this is a solution within the context we're dealing with, but it's only it won't be a solution if we continue to go downhill and turn away from God. If we don't turn back to God, this will be at best a temporary Band-Aid solution.
Christians have to get involved.
Yeah, that's right.